Hey there, how's it going everybody? So a few weeks ago, I released a video on 10 Python tips and tricks for writing better code, and a lot of you said that you found that video pretty helpful. So in this video, I've compiled together another list of topics that I thought would be beneficial, and that's the 5 most common mistakes that I see from people when using Python and how to avoid those. Now, I get questions every day from people who follow along with my videos, and a lot of the questions have to do with the mistakes that we're going to discuss in this video. And it's not always obvious what the problem is. So we're going to look at the cause and solution to all of these. Now, we do have a sponsor for this video, and that's Skillshare.com. So I'd like to thank them for supporting the channel, and it'd be great if you all could check them out using the link in the description section below and support the sponsors. And I'll talk more about their services in just a bit. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first mistake that I'm going to talk about is one that I see a lot with people who are brand new to Python. Now, if you're not new to Python, then definitely stick around because we're going to talk about some more advanced issues as well. But this is one that I definitely see among people who are just getting started out. And that is when people mix tabs and spaces or are inconsistent with their tabs and spaces. And that leads to indentation errors. So I have a file open up here. So let's take a look at what this looks like. Now, the reason that I say that this is usually a mistake by people who are just starting out is because once you get your development environment set up properly, then it's almost impossible to run into this problem. But people who are just starting out might use some basic text editor where it's possible to mix tabs and spaces. So I have my Sublime Text set up to convert all of my tabs to spaces. But let me turn that off and show you what this does. So up here in my Sublime Text settings, I'm going to change the settings. Now, if I have more settings here, then don't worry about it. But we can see here that I have mine set up to translate tabs to spaces. And I'm just going to set that to false. And now let's see what happens when we mix these. So now I just have a basic program here that just loops through a list and squares the numbers. So on this line, I'm going to unindent this, and I'm going to use a tab for that line. Now for this next line, I'm going to unindent that, and I'm going to use spaces for that line. So I have one tab here, and I have 4 spaces here. So this program, just looking at it, it actually looks correct. There's nothing that I can see here that looks wrong. But if I run this, I'm going to save it and run it. We can see that we get an error down here that says indentation error, unindent does not match any outer indentation level. And really, that exact message might not be very helpful either. There's a couple of other indentation errors that give you different messages. Now, if you're new to Python, then you're not going to have any clue what that means, especially whenever everything just looks fine in your program at a glance. Now, imagine that this module was a lot larger. We just have 2 indentations here, but imagine that we have, 500 or 1,000 lines of code. It's going to be almost impossible to go through there and figure out which ones are using tabs and which ones are using spaces. So instead of trying to go through and fix those manually, I would just highly recommend simply upgrading your editor or IDE that you're using. So any good editor for Python is going to be able to convert your tabs to spaces automatically. So I'm using Sublime Text, but you can set this up in VS Code, PyCharm, Eclipse, or whatever it is that you use. If you're not using an editor that can do this, then I recommend getting a new editor. So I'm going to go back in Sublime Text. You do this by changing your settings here, and it's just a changed setting where you can set translate tabs to spaces, and I'm going to set that to true. And now I think I have to make a change to resave this, but let's redo this. So I'm going to tab that line, and I'm going to do spaces on that line. Now, even though those were different, if I save this and run it, then we can see that our program still works. And that is because Sublime Text automatically changed this tab here to 4 spaces. So that works nicely. Now, on top of having an editor that does this for you, I would also recommend using a tool like Pylint that catches more mistakes like this for you that are easy to miss just by looking at your program. Okay, so now let's move on to some slightly more advanced problems. So one big problem that I see is when people name their Python modules the same name as something that they're trying to import. Now, when you do this, your module with the same name takes higher priority than the modules from the standard library or the modules that you installed using pip. So let's see an example of what this would look like. So let's say that I have a project where I want to create a Python module that will do some mathematical calculations for me. So I'm going to create a new module in my current directory. So a new file here, and I'm just going to call this math.py. And now I'm going to use radians and a sine function from the math module in the standard library to make some calculations. So I'm going to say from math, which is a module in the standard library, import radians, and I'm also going to import the sine function. And then I'll just grab the radians of 90 degrees. So I'll say rads is equal to radians of 90 degrees. And now let's print out the sine of those radians. If you don't know the math here, don't worry about it. That's not what that's not what the tutorial is about. It's about how the imports are working here. So this should print out 1 here because that is what the sine of these radians should be equal to. So if I save this and run it, then it seems like this is a nice simple script, but now it's saying that we get an import error. Cannot import name radians from math. Now, this is strange because the math module is in the standard library. There's no reason that it shouldn't be able to find that. But the reason is because we named our own module math.py, and Python is trying to import radians and sine from our own module instead of the standard library. So, to fix this, all we have to do is rename our module. So I'm going to come over here into, I know that this sidebar is hard to see here, but down here we can see that our current module is named math.py. I'm just going to rename this to project.py. And now, if I save this and run it, then we can see that it runs just fine because it was actually importing the radians and sine from the standard library math module instead of trying to import it from our math module. Now, this is usually pretty easy to catch when you accidentally name something the same as a module from the standard library, because if you can't import a module from the standard library, then it's pretty limited as to what the problems could be, and this is one of them. But if this was a package that we pip installed, like Flask or Django, then this could possibly take more time to figure out. So there are a lot of times that I've tried to help people debug a problem where they're trying to write a Flask application or something like that, and they have Flask installed, and they're using the right version of Python, but when they go to import Flask, it throws an import error. And sometimes it takes me a while to figure it out because they only send me their code, but not their file name. So my initial reaction or my initial intuition with import errors is that it's probably something with their path. It's an issue with their path. But then later, I'll finally realize that they named their module flask.py, and that's going to interfere with the Flask that they're trying to import. So if you ever get an import error, then it can definitely be an issue with your path, and I've made videos on that in the past, but sometimes it's as simple as having your file name the same thing as the module that you're trying to import. Now, we can also make naming mistakes when we're trying to name a variable, and that's whenever we name a variable the same thing as something else that you'd like to use. So there's nothing that prevents us from creating a variable with the same name as something else in Python. So for example, let's say that instead of calling our variable here rads, let's just say that I wasn't really thinking at the time, and instead I just called that radians. But radians is the same name as the function that we're importing here. So if I change that variable there, and I also change the print statement there to use those radians, if I save that and run it, then the code still runs and it looks like it works fine. But now let's try to use the radians function again further down. So I'm going to comment out this print statement, and I'm going to say, rad 45 is equal to radians of 45 degrees. And now let's print out rad 45. If I save that and run it, then now it's giving us an issue here, and this might not make sense immediately. It's saying float object is not callable. Now the reason is because we created a variable up here called radians that is equal to radians of 90 degrees, which is some float value. So anytime we reference radians after that assignment, it's going to use that radians variable and not the radians function that we imported. So that's why when we say that we want the radians of 45 degrees, Python is telling us that radians isn't a function, it's a float value, and the float value isn't callable like we're trying to call it here. So a lot of people get frustrated with Python when things like this happen to them for the first time, but Python isn't a compiled language in the sense where it's going to pick these things up before we run the code. And it also doesn't hold your hand and give the developer those types of restrictions. It gives you a lot of freedom, but sometimes that freedom allows us to do things like this where we don't think that we should actually be able to do this, like overriding a function like this, but it's just how it works. So that freedom allows us to do a lot of cool things with Python and allows us to write code very quickly, but we can also step on our own toes if we aren't careful. So we can see if I simply name this something else like rad90 or rads or something like that and run that, then we can see that now it works fine. Okay, so the next thing that I've seen some people get tripped up on is mutable default arguments. And I had an example of this in my object-oriented series where I had a function that added employees to a list, and a lot of people asked me why I just didn't pass in an empty list as a default argument. And I told them it was because of this problem with mutable default arguments. And we'll see why in an example here that's similar to the one that I had in that video. So let me close down my output here and also close my sidebar. So here we have a function called addEmployee. So let me explain what this function is meant to do. So it takes in a single employee and also an employee list as arguments. And it's simply going to add that employee to this employee list and then print that list. But we can see here that the employee list has a default value equal to an empty list. So if we don't pass an employee list to the function, then it should just create a new list for us from scratch. So let's see what this does. So I have an existing list of employees down here. So let me add a new employee to that list using that addEmployee function. So I'm just going to say addEmployee, and I will add Corey as the employee. And the list that we want to add this to is just going to be this EMPS list here. So if I run this, then it should print out this employee list here with this new employee added on. So if I save that and run it, then we can see that that looks good. We have our existing list and that employee was appended to that list. Okay, but now let's add a couple of employees without providing an existing list. So I'm going to take away our existing list, and now it should just use this empty list as a default. So now let me add a couple here. So I'll add Corey and I'll also add John. So we would think that both times we run this, that we'll get a new list of one person because we're not passing in an existing list. So it should use an empty list by default for both of these each time the function is called. But if I run this, we can see that our first value created a new list, but our second addEmployee here, it got added on to that list, well, which is kind of strange. And this will actually keep going. So if I add another employee here and I'm still not providing an existing list, it should be creating a new list every time. But each time the list just gets longer and longer and keeps appending to the same list, even though we should have that empty list by default. So what's going on here is that in Python, default arguments are evaluated once at the time it creates the function. So it's not actually creating a new empty list each time we run the function. Now, you won't notice this with immutable types like strings and things like that, but with mutable data types like a list, it's using the same list that it created when the function was defined. So what do we do here if we want to be sure that we get an empty list each time? So to do this, instead, we're going to want to do something like this. So instead of passing in and a mutable default type, and lists are mutable, we just want to pass in employee list is equal to none. And now down here within the function, we can say if employee list is none, or you can say if not employee list, either one, then we can create an employee list equal to a new empty list. So now that this is actually within the function, this will get run every time the function is run because, like I said, these only get evaluated once when we initialize the function. So now, if I run this, then we can see that it works as expected. It creates a new empty list each time we add an employee without an existing employee list. And this should still work the same as before as well. If we do provide an employee list already, then it just gets tacked on to that existing list. So this is how you do mutable default arguments. Now, this doesn't only give us unexpected problems with lists. When I said that default arguments are executed once when the function is created and not each time the function is called, then you can probably think of some other examples where this might not give us what you think is the desired behavior. So for example, let's say that I have a function like I have commented out down here. Let me just get rid of our current example here, and I will uncomment it, this other example that I've created here. So here I have a function called display time, and it will print out a time in a specific format that I have specified here. Now it takes time as an argument, and time has a default value here set to datetime.now, or that is, if we don't provide a time, then it will use datetime.now as the default time. So you might expect that every time we run this function, it gets the current time if we don't provide one. But I'm running this a few times down here at the bottom and sleeping between each function call for 1 second. So if I run this, then we might expect that this second would be incrementing by 1 each time because we're sleeping a second between each function call here. But we can see that each time it ran, it didn't update the time like you might expect. Now the reason, just like before, is because it only executes those default arguments once when the function is declared and not each time the function is run. So again, in order to do this, we would instead just need to move this into the function itself. So I could do something like this. I could just say time is equal to none, and if time is none, then let's just set the time equal to datetime.now. So now, if I run this, then we can see that it sleeps 1 second between the function calls, but it actually got the current time since we didn't provide it one. So actually knowing how those default arguments work is one thing that I see that trips up a lot of people. Okay, so moving on, another question that I get asked a lot and a common mistake that I see is when people don't fully understand how iterators work and how they're exhausted. So this is especially true with a lot of people moving from Python 2 over to Python 3 because more things within Python 3 now behave like generators because those are more efficient, but it does cause people some confusion. So let's take a look at what I mean here. So let me close down the output down here. So within this file, I'm using an example that I've used in videos before. I have a list of regular names from comic book characters, and I have another list of their superhero names. And the two lists are related. So the first item of the names list goes with the first item of the superheroes list, and they have corresponding indexes that we can use the zip function for, like I'm doing here. So once I use that zip function, then I'm going to print out the result here. So first, let me show you what this used to print out in Python 2. So let me go up here and change my build system, and I'm going to switch over to Python 2. So now I'm using Python 2. So if I run this, then by using Python 2, we can see that we get a list of those paired items, and that's what zip does. It zipped up the first item of the names list with the first item of the superhero list. So we have Peter Parker and Spider-Man, then Clark Kent and Superman, and so on. So what if I wanted to loop over these one at a time and print them out? If I wanted to do that, then I could just simply loop over them. And that's what I'm doing in this commented section here. So let me uncomment out this here, and I'm actually using the format method here because I'm using Python 2 and F strings won't work in Python 2. So we can see that we have a placeholder here with the first value of the identity, which should be Peter Parker, and then we have another placeholder for the second value, which is Spider-Man, and we're looping over all of these here, so it should print those out one at a time. So let me make this a little larger here, and we can see that that is what it does. Okay, so that seems pretty standard for how we would expect this stuff to work, but now let me switch over to Python 3. A lot of people just try to directly run their code from Python 2 in Python 3 and expect the same results. But with things like zip, they might behave a bit differently. So now I've switched over to using Python 3, and now let me run this same code. So it kind of looks the same. We still are looping through the values here, but now whenever we printed out these identities, we instead get this zip object instead of that entire list of those zipped items. So what's going on here is that Python 3 no longer returns all of those values at once. And that's good for efficiency because if this was a huge list of millions of values, then we're going to save memory, but it might not be what you expect. Now, if you watch my videos on generators and iterators, then you know that we can get all of those values at once, but we'll have to cast them to a list. So let me create a list of our zip object here. So I'm just going to pass that into a list here. So now if I save that and run it, then now we get that full list of our zipped items, but now it's no longer looping through and printing out these items here within our loop. So this is where a lot of people usually get frustrated if they don't know what's going on. Now, I have a lot of older videos on Python 2 where people try to follow along in Python 3 and they run into issues just like this and, leave comments and send me emails asking me what's going on. So what's happening here is that zip is an iterator, like I said. And iterators can be exhausted. And that means that we can loop through and access their values one time, but then we can't do it again. So that might not make sense, but like I said, it all comes down to performance and efficiency. And really, once you know that, it really isn't a big deal. You can still do everything that you used to be able to do, but you just have to do it in a slightly different way. So here, we're converting our zip object to a list and then trying to loop over that same zip object again. But we've already exhausted the zip object when we converted it to a list at this line here. When we did this, it looped through all those values and converted them to a list, and then we printed them out. So now when we're trying to loop over that here, it's not working because this has been exhausted and there's no more values left here. But if you wanted to print the values out and also loop over them, then we could simply convert it to a list from the start and then print that list and then loop over it just like we would with any other list. So instead of printing out this list of identities here and not capturing that value, instead, I'm just going to convert this to a list from the start. And now we've captured that into a list here. So now I can print out those identities and also loop over them because now this is a list and lists are not exhausted like other iterators or generators. So now if we run this, then we can see that we get the same result that we got in Python 2. Now, if you'd like more details on how generators and iterators work, then I do have videos on both of those topics. In this video, I just really wanted to touch on the confusion that I see from some people on not understanding how iterators can be exhausted, and when they are, why you can no longer access those values again a second time through. Okay, so now the last thing that I want to discuss is imports and a bad practice that I see sometimes that can cause some errors. And even if the code doesn't cause errors, it can definitely make it harder to debug your code. So the bad practice that I'm talking about is using an asterisk when doing imports. Now, if you don't know what using an asterisk on imports does, basically it just imports everything from a given module. So for example, I could import a module by doing something like this. I could do import OS. And then if I wanted to rename a file, then I could do something like os.rename, and then we could just pass in a file name here. So for every function from the OS module, I would have to say os dot and then the function name like we're doing here, os.rename. But we can also import functions one at a time to where we don't need to use os dot. So for example, if I just wanted to use rename a file name, then instead I could say from os import rename. And now we no longer need to say os.rename. We can simply just use the rename function. But for each additional function that I wanted to use, I would have to add that onto the import. So if I wanted to use the remove function to remove a file, then I would have to add that to my imports here. So from os, import rename, and import remove. And then I'm also going to be able to use that remove function. Now, we can also use an asterisk on the import to just simply import everything. But this is a bad practice most of the time, unless you really know what you're doing. But sometimes people just want to be able to use everything and not think about it. So they'll just come up here and say from OS import asterisk, import star. And that will allow us to use rename and remove and anything else that is in the OS module without using os dot. Okay, but why is this a bad practice? So first of all, it can make your code hard to debug. So if our module was 500 lines of code here and halfway down I use this rename function, then other people reading our code, or even us in the future when we come back to read our code, we're going to wonder, where is this rename function coming from? I need to go read that and see where it's declared so that I can understand what it's doing. But they're not going to know where it was declared because it's hidden within this asterisk and it isn't explicit. If we were to actually say from OS import rename, then we could come up to the top and say, oh, okay, there is where that rename function is coming from. We imported it from the OS module. Now, not only does it make it hard to debug, but it can also introduce errors into our code whenever there are two functions with the same name. So for example, let's say I did something like this. What if I said from HTML import star, and then from glob import star? Both of these are standard library modules, and I'm importing everything from both of those modules. But the HTML and the glob modules both have an escape function. And one escapes HTML special characters from the HTML module, and the other escapes special characters in a path, and that's from the glob module. So in this case, which escape module is actually getting imported? So the HTML escape function will be overwritten by the glob escape function. So if I was to say print help on escape, if I save that and run it, then we can see that our output down here says help on function escape in the module glob. So by importing using these asterisks, it's just extremely easy to confuse people reading your code, and it's a pain to debug, and also it can cause issues like this. So anytime you need to actually import from a module, then it's better to instead just import it explicitly. So if I wanted to import both of these, then I could just say import escape and import escape. Now those are still going to be overwritten, so we have to rename these. So I could say import as h underscore escape and as g underscore escape. And now when we use the HTML escape, we would use this one, and when we use the glob escape, we would use this one. Or if you wanted to just import the entire module, then you could just say, import HTML and import glob, and then when you use those, you could just use HTML.escape and use glob.escape. So that is the best way to do it. Definitely, you're just going to confuse people and obfuscate your code if you use those asterisk imports. Okay, so before we end this video, I want to mention the sponsor for this video, and that is Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with more than 25,000 classes in tech, business, design, and a lot of other topics. They have over 7 million students so far, and they have new courses coming out on a regular basis. Now, my audience would most likely be interested in their programming courses. And you can see here that they have classes in data science, data visualization. They have some courses in introduction to programming and computer science, deep learning and neural networks using Python. They have some SQL courses and all kinds of different popular series that you can find useful. Now, I'm also frequently asked how I make YouTube videos and if I have any tips for any of you who would like to start a channel. Now, I may do some videos like these in the future, but Skillshare is really the place to go to learn about something like this. They have courses specifically on YouTube and how to grow that as a business. And if you're more focused on film production rather than YouTube itself, then they also have a wide variety of courses on videography and photography as well. So I want to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and it would be great if you could go and check them out and support the sponsors for this channel. And they've provided me with a sign-up link that I'll post in the description section below. And the first 500 people to sign up using that link will get 2 free months of Skillshare Premium so that you can check it out and see how you like it. Okay, so I think that is going to do it for this video. I hope that you found it useful to go over this overview of some of the most common mistakes that I usually see. And also, I'm interested if there are any problems that I didn't cover here that you run into in your daily coding. So if you want, be sure to comment those in the description section below. Now, if anyone has any questions about what we covered here, then feel free to ask in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer those. And if you enjoy these tutorials and would like to support them, then there are several ways you can do that. The easiest way is to simply like the video and give it a thumbs up. And also, it's a huge help to share these videos with anyone who you think would find them useful. And if you have the means, you can contribute through Patreon, and there's a link to that page in the description section below. Be sure to subscribe for future videos, and thank you all for watching.